Hello and welcome to this week's Force.comcast episode, Why Can't I Cast My Sets? So last week I was working with a colleague of mine, John Daniel, whose Twitter profile you can see here, and John was working with a bit of code where he was having to try and cast a set of S objects that he was being passed in as a method parameter into a set of user objects, and for some reason it wasn't working. He was getting an invalid casting error, and he just happened to mention it to me. And so we were discussing why this might be. Neither of us could figure it out, so I've gone and done some research. So let's just go through step by step here about Apex collections and some of the casting we can do. So what we're going to do is we're going to work with lists to start with, and then move on to sets, and just to highlight kind of the difference between them. So I've got a set of different code here that I'm going to work through, and I'll make this available at the bottom of the video below so you can watch it. And you can test this code out for yourself. So the first thing we've got here is a list of the generic object type, and we just put a series of strings in here because that's fine. Strings do inherit from the object type, and what we're going to do is we're going to try and cast this to a list of strings and just output the size and see if this works. So let's go into our execute anonymous statements here, and if we execute this code, what we're hoping is that we'll get something debugging just the number 9. I think there should be 9 entries in there. But instead what we get is an invalid conversion from the run type. And so this is a strange error. We know that string does inherit from object, but for some reason we can't convert a list of objects or a collection of objects into a collection of strings. So we'll bear that in mind, and we'll come back to that in a minute or two. And the next thing we're going to do, however, is try and do the reverse. So let's instead have our initial list as being a list of strings. And if we go in now and run this code where we've got a list of strings here, which is the same set of strings, and we try and cast that to a list of objects, let's see what we get on the output this time. And when we run it this time, we can see that it does output the number 9, so we've got 9 entries in there, and it's managed to convert and cast correctly from a set of strings, or a list of strings, sorry, into a list of object types. So what we've managed to do is we can show that we can cast from a child type to a parent type, because in the inheritance hierarchy, string inherits from object. But if we do the reverse, if we try and cast from the parent type of object down to the child type of string, it doesn't work for us. So similarly, now let's just try taking our list of strings, and what we're going to do is just put it straight into a set. So sets have a constructor method that allows you to pass in just a string, and a list, and that list has to be of the same type. So here we're doing this, and if we run this code, it should all work for us. I mean, there's nothing difficult we're doing here. This is just really confirming that the documentation is correct. But running this code, it should go away, put our list in, and then remove the duplications. And so we get 5. So yes, string set size is 5, which is fantastic. Now if we try and do the same, but passing in this list of strings as into the constructor for an object set, then what we'll see is we should get, again, a different error. So when we run this code, what we're trying to do is, instead of passing in a list of object type, or the same type as the set, into it, we're going to try and pass in a list of strings, and again we get an error, which is an invalid initial value type list for set. So it's the wrong type of list going in there. So what happens now if we cast our string list into a list of objects and then pass that into the set? So based upon the rules of the method declaration, it should be able to accept a list of objects and create a set from that. So if we paste this code in, all we're doing here is we replace the one line, and instead of just passing in the list of strings, we're now converting it or casting it to a list of objects, which we did previously up here, and we saw that worked okay. So if we now execute this method and let it run in the background, what we'll see is that it will return for us a success message, and again we've got the correct number of items in there, so we've only got 5 items. Now what's interesting to note, however, is that although we can't do a direct cast from a list of objects to a list of strings, we can do it if we iterate through. So if we were to take this code here and have a list of objects again, the same list that we had defined right at the very start, and if we create a new list of strings but just iterate through our object list and then do the cast one by one, then when we run this code, it will work fine. So we can do the casting on a one-to-one basis from the subtype to the parent type, and that works fine. So obviously that's very interesting. You've managed to go through and run a bunch of code and see some standard error messages. So what am I trying to show you really here? So in going through the Apex documentation and trying to understand a little bit more about how the casting system works, I stumbled across the fact that collections within Salesforce do have the ability to be cast. And most importantly, or more importantly rather, only maps and lists have the ability to have interfaces defined as their type. So when we're doing this casting from the list of strings to the list of objects, that's working because the list has an understanding of what its subtype is. So because we have passed in the object type, it knows that here, for example on line 12, we passed in the object type as the type for the list. It then knows what the subtypes of that are, so when we pass in a list of strings, we can add that into the collection. So Salesforce documents this within the Apex developer guide and does let you know about it. What's interesting is that sets don't have the ability to have an interface defined as their type. Now the reason for this, it dawned upon me, was because sets are unique. So the reason we can't do the casting from one type of a set to another type is that sets have the requirement that every item within the set must be unique. So this is why when we did this code here, we had 5 members returned because it removed the duplicates. So if you want to use a custom type on a set, you have to, a custom class on a set, you have to provide 2 methods, the equals method and the hashcode method. And these 2 methods allow you to test whether or not 2 instances of that class are equal. And in a future video, I'll go through and I'll create a custom type and do that for us so we can see how that difference works. But when you have a parent type and you inherit from that, and you have a subtype, the two methods, the equals methods and the hashcode method, can be different between those two. So whereas with lists and maps, all we're doing is having a particular key and we're placing that in there so that we can know where it goes. So we can place any item within the value for that, or on a list we just have an array of objects that we're putting on there. With a set, because we have to maintain the uniqueness of each object on there, we can't do that if they're of 2 different types, because the child type can override or have a different implementation for those 2 methods, which means that if you have 2 items on one set, they might be equal, but those 2 items on a different set, which are using a different method, may not be equal, and so both may exist. So that's the reason you can't do casting from one set to another. But what you can do as a workaround is if you do get into this situation where you need to change one set to another, you can take that set, create a list from it, cast the list, and then create a new set from that list. And that will work fine for you. It's a little bit long-winded and obviously takes a bit of time. If you know your set is small enough, you might be able to loop through like we've done here, and that will work fine. Obviously, you can refer back to the faster loops videos to see how that would help out. But essentially that's the reason, is because sets must be unique. You cannot cast from one set, from a set of one type to a set of another.